Williams Keepers presents How to Fill Out Form 3508S for borrowers seeking forgiveness of loans $150,000 or less. In this video, we are going to discuss how to fill out Form 3508S, a simplified application for the forgiveness of PPP loans. There have been many versions of Form 3508S released over the past year. We will be working through version 6, which was effective as of January 19, 2021. The purpose of this latest release was to allow for a more simplified form for those borrowers with loans of $150,000 or less. Previously, the simplified form was only available to borrowers with loans of $50,000 or less. The main distinguishing factor between this form and the 3508EZ is that this form doesn't require the borrower to submit any supporting documents. However, keep in mind that records would need to be produced should your lender or the SBA ask. It is important to maintain these records should the SBA decide to audit your forgiveness application. We will discuss more about what documents you should maintain later in this video. Now let's dive into the form. First, you will see places for you to enter your business's name, address, identification number, phone, etc. This information is consistent across all the forgiveness forms. With the latest form release, the SBA added an NAICS code. This code may be pulled from your tax return. If you have trouble locating or you don't have one, contact your tax advisor. The form then asks you to check whether this forgiveness application relates to the first draw of PPP loans or the second draw of PPP loans. If you only have one PPP loan, check the first draw PPP loan option. Next, you will enter your SBA PPP loan number and your lender's PPP loan number. Your lender should be able to provide both items to you. In the majority of cases, these numbers have been different, but Williams Keepers has encountered instances where the lender assigned a loan number identical to that of the SBA. Moving on, the application requests the loan amount and the disbursement date of the loan. The disbursement date should be the date the funds were deposited into your account, the loan amount being the amount of funds deposited. If you are unsure of either of these items, please contact your lender. If your loan amount is greater than $150,000, you should not be using Form 3508S. Forms 3508EZ and 3508 are available to you. If you need help deciding which forms to use, please contact your advisor. If you received your loan proceeds on more than one date, please enter the first date received. The disbursement date is important for determining covered period, which will be discussed shortly. For example, we're going to assume our loan is $150,000 and our disbursement date is April 15th, 2020. The form now requires you to enter the number of employees at both the time of your original loan application and at the time of forgiveness. These numbers are strictly headcount figures. As such, part-time and full-time employees each count as 1. For our example, we're going to assume we had 5 both at the time of the loan application and at the time of forgiveness. You can find your number of employees at time of loan application on your original loan application. Here's an example of where it sits on the form. Now it's time to decide your covered period. The covered period begins on the date the loan was originally disbursed. In our example, our disbursement date is April 15th, 2020. Therefore, it's the beginning of our covered period. At this point, you may decide how long you want your covered period to be. The form provides dollar amounts for payroll limits based on 8 weeks or 24 weeks. We will discuss these limits momentarily, but we suggest you choose an 8-week or a 24-week period to reduce the administrative burden of adjusting these limits. For purposes of this example, we've chosen a 24-week covered period to maximize our payroll costs. But you may choose a covered period between 8 and 24 weeks. If you need help figuring out your covered period, you can use Google to calculate for you if you enter into their search bar. Next, the form is asking that if you're part of an affiliated group, you disclose that all your PPP loans together were $2 million or more. If you're unsure of your affiliates, again, contact your advisor. In our example, we are not part of an affiliated group. Alright, now the fun begins. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that although we are not required to submit documentation, we should still maintain records. Your records should correspond with the amount of payroll costs you enter on this line. The SBA's intention is for us to have spent at least 60% of our loan proceeds on payroll costs. The form is merely asking for us to do our due diligence in proving this requirement. The other 40% can be spent on rent, utilities, and other various expenses, but Form 3508S is not asking us to quantify each category of non-payroll costs, as the other longer forms do. At this point, we should start with the payroll calculation and see if we've met the 60% requirement. Now, before beginning your eligible payroll calculation, there are a few items to consider. First, consider if you've taken the employee retention credit, as this will directly impact your amount of available payroll costs during the covered period. Second, if your covered period is between 8 and 24 weeks, this may impact your limit calculation. Third, if you reduce the number of employee hours during the covered period, an additional calculation would be necessary. Fourth, if you suffered a business reduction during the covered period, there may be a safe harbor in place for you to avoid additional calculations. Please contact your advisor if any of the above apply to you. Okay, let's dive into our example calculation of eligible payroll costs. Here's our 24-week payroll report for our 5 employees. The instructions provide for 2 limitations when determining eligible payroll costs. The first is for employees whose annualized wages for the covered period exceed $100,000. If you have an employee whose annualized wages for the covered period exceeds $100,000, then for a 24-week period, their eligible gross wages will be limited to $46,154. If your covered period is less than 24 weeks, this limitation will reduce proportionally. In our example here, employee B makes over $100,000 annually, and their eligible gross wages will be capped at $46,154. Also note that this employee gross wage limit does not apply to employer-covered health insurance, retirement benefits, or certain employer-paid taxes on these wages. If you find that gross wages alone do not get you to the 60% requirement, consider including these employee benefit costs. While the first limitation applies to employees who make over $100,000 a year, the second payroll limitation applies to owners' gross wages. For a covered period of 24 weeks, owners are capped at $20,833. If an 8-week covered period is used, owners' wages are capped at $15,385. Now, for our example of the owner's limitation calculation, let's assume we obtained our PPP loan using 2019 wages. We would calculate our limitation based on our owner's 2019 wages. Our limit will be the lesser of $20,833 or the 2.5-month equivalent of the owner's 2019 wages. In our example, our owner's total income in 2019 was $65,000. To calculate 2019's 2.5-month equivalent, we will take the owner's annual compensation of $65,000 and divide by 12 and then multiply by 2.5 months. We will arrive at $13,542. Since 2019's 2.5-month equivalent is less than $20,833, our eligible owner compensation will be $13,542. Please note that for current forgiveness applications of the first round of PPP loans issued before the December Act will be based on 2019 wages, as in this example. But for future PPP loans issued after the December Act, they could be based on either 2019 or 2020 wages. Now here's a visual of our example calculation for total allowed wages. Although we had gross wages during the covered period of $163,400, only $137,696 will be applied towards our forgiveness. This is because we had to limit our employee who made more than $100,000 in 2020, as well as our owner's wages. Fortunately, this figure gets us well above the 60% requirement. If this is not the case for your business after your calculation, you should contact your advisor. Now we can indicate on the form how much of our loan we spent on payroll costs. If your total qualified payroll costs exceeded the amount of your loan, you should enter the entire loan amount as that requested to be forgiven and move on to the next section. This is not the case for our example. We need to next analyze the remaining amount to be forgiven. We've calculated the amount of our loan spent on payroll costs, so now we need to determine how we can expand our costs to reach full forgiveness. Although our payroll costs met the 60% requirement, they didn't cover the entire loan amount. At this point, we need to review what other non-payroll costs we could include to fill the gap between payroll costs and the amount of the loan. The SBA has been generous with what qualifies, including but not limited to rent, utilities, interest, and COVID precaution expenses. If you are unsure of other qualifying expenses, please contact your advisor. To demonstrate how we arrived at full forgiveness in our example, here's our total covered period expenses calculation. We have our eligible payroll costs, which we calculated earlier in the presentation, plus $9,000 in rent during our covered period, and $5,000 in utilities during our covered period. The total of these three items is greater than our loan amount. Therefore, we can reasonably request the full forgiveness of $150,000. We can now request full forgiveness on the face of the form. Keep in mind that although we do not have to list our non-payroll expenses of rent and utilities, we're still required to maintain receipts or proof of these expenses should the SBA request this information. So now that we've done the calculation necessary to prove that we can request full forgiveness, we can move on to the representations and certifications section. Here we are certifying that we did the necessary calculation and that the amount of the loan we requested to be forgiven is accurate. In our example, a list of documents we should retain in case we were ever audited would be wages during the covered period, our eligible payroll cost calculation, proof of our rent expenses during the covered period. This could be invoices or bank statements, proof of our utilities during the covered period. This could also be invoices or bank statements. Please refer to the instructions for a complete list of documents to retain. Your last step is to sign your forgiveness application and submit it to your lender. Remember, keep all supporting documents that helped you arrive at both your payroll cost number and your loan forgiveness amount. If the SBA were to audit you, you would need to produce these items. The instructions state that the borrower must retain all documentation for 6 years after the date the loan is forgiven. If you have any questions regarding the PPP or other COVID relief measures, please reach out to your advisor or contact Williams Keepers at 573-442-6171. Thanks for listening.